Talkie. Listen, learn, and speak better.
Hey everyone, welcome to the very first episode of Talkie. I'm Alex Carter.
And I'm Emma Brooks. We're really excited you're here because we've been looking forward to launching this podcast for quite a while.
We definitely have. The idea behind Talkie is actually pretty simple. Every week, we'll sit down, pick a topic that people genuinely struggle with or are curious about, and just have a relaxed conversation about it. No complicated explanations, no lectures, just two people talking things through and sharing ideas that we hope are actually useful.
Exactly. Think of it as joining two friends for a conversation over a cup of coffee. Sometimes we'll agree, sometimes we'll challenge each other's opinions, and sometimes we'll probably end up laughing at our own stories. But by the end of each episode, our goal is that you've learned something new, or at least walked away with a different perspective.
And since this is our very first episode, we wanted to start with a topic that I think almost every English learner has experienced at some point. You understand English. You watch YouTube without much trouble. You listen to podcasts. You can read articles. Maybe you even think, my English is actually pretty good. Then someone asks you a simple question. So, tell me a little about yourself. And suddenly your mind goes completely blank.
It's honestly one of the strangest feelings, isn't it? Because it's not like you don't know English. You do. You've spent months or maybe even years learning it. You know hundreds, maybe thousands of words. But for some reason, the moment it's your turn to speak, everything just disappears.
It's almost like your brain says, thanks for all the vocabulary, but we're closed today.
Exactly. It's like your brain decides to take a coffee break at the worst possible moment.
And the funny thing is, people usually react in one of two ways. Either they think, maybe I need to learn more vocabulary, or they decide their grammar isn't good enough. So they spend another 6 months memorizing words or studying grammar rules. Then they try speaking again, and the exact same thing happens.
I think that's because most of us grow up believing that language learning works like studying math or history. We think if we just keep collecting more information, eventually we'll become fluent. But speaking doesn't really work like that. Knowing something and being able to use it instantly are two completely different skills.
That's actually one of the biggest things we're going to talk about today, because here's something that surprised me when I first learned it. Understanding English and speaking English are connected, but they're not the same skill. And I don't think enough people realize that.
I completely agree. Imagine someone who's watched football for 10 years. They know all the rules, they know every famous player, they can predict what teams are going to do next. Does that automatically make them a great football player? Of course not. Actually getting onto the field and playing is a completely different experience.
That's such a good comparison. Watching football teaches you how the game works. Playing football teaches your body how to react. Speaking English is kind of the same thing. Listening teaches your brain to recognize English. Speaking teaches your brain to create English. Those are two different jobs.
And I think that's where a lot of learners get frustrated because they expect those skills to develop at exactly the same speed. They'll say something like, I understand 80% of English videos now, so why can't I speak? But those two abilities grow differently. Sometimes your listening improves much faster than your speaking, and that's completely normal.
You know what's interesting? I was reading about this recently, and language teachers often talk about something called passive vocabulary and active vocabulary. When I first heard those terms, I thought they sounded much more complicated than they actually are.
They're actually pretty simple once someone explains them. Passive vocabulary is every word you recognize when you hear it or read it. Active vocabulary is the words you can instantly use in conversation without having to stop and think. And here's the surprising part. Your passive vocabulary is almost always much bigger.
Way bigger. You might recognize 5,000 English words, but only feel comfortable using 1,000 of them while you're speaking. And that's perfectly normal.
Exactly. Think about your own language for a second. I'm sure there are words you understand perfectly when someone else says them, but you almost never use those words yourself. That's true in every language. So when you're learning English, that gap becomes even bigger.
And unfortunately, a lot of learners see that gap and think something is wrong with them. They think, maybe I'm just bad at languages, or maybe I'm not smart enough. When in reality, they're experiencing something almost everyone goes through.
I wish more people knew that, because honestly, one of the worst feelings is believing you're the only one struggling. You see people online speaking fluent English, and you start comparing yourself to them. What you don't see are the hundreds of awkward conversations they had before they became confident.
That's such a good point. Nobody uploads the video where they spend 30 seconds trying to remember the word umbrella. They only upload the polished version after years of practice.
Exactly. Nobody wants the blooper reel.
Maybe they should. I actually think it would encourage a lot more people to start speaking.
I agree, because mistakes aren't proof that you're failing, they're proof that you're practicing. And that's a mindset shift that took me a long time to understand.
So here's a question. If understanding English isn't the problem, what actually stops people from speaking? Is it vocabulary? Grammar? Confidence? Fear? Or is it something completely different?
Honestly, I think it's a combination of several things. But if I had to choose one biggest reason, I'd say it's the habit of translating everything in your head before you speak. And once that habit becomes automatic, that's where the real struggle begins.
I couldn't agree more. And that's exactly where we're going next. Because translating in your head feels helpful, but it might actually be one of the biggest reasons people stay stuck for years.
You know, I used to think translating was just part of learning a language. It felt logical. Someone asks you a question in English, you think of the answer in your own language, translate it into English, check if the grammar sounds right, and then finally say it. The problem is, all of that happens in just a few seconds.
And those few seconds feel like forever in a conversation. Imagine someone asks, "What did you do this weekend?" They're expecting an answer almost immediately. Meanwhile, your brain is running through 4 different steps before you've even opened your mouth.
Exactly. It's almost like your brain has too many tabs open. First, you're thinking about the idea, then you're translating, then you're wondering if the tense is correct, then you're trying to remember the right vocabulary, and while all that's happening, the other person is just standing there waiting.
I think that's why so many learners say, "I can write much better than I can speak." When you're writing, there's no pressure. You can stop, think, change a word, rewrite a sentence, even look something up if you need to. Speaking doesn't give you that luxury.
Right. Conversations move quickly. Nobody pauses for 30 seconds after every sentence to make sure it's grammatically perfect. Native speakers don't do that either. They're not secretly checking grammar rules in their heads every time they speak. They're just expressing ideas.
That's actually something that surprised me. A lot of learners think fluent speakers are mentally building sentences using grammar formulas, but that's not really what's happening. It's more like muscle memory. When someone asks, "How are you?" you don't think about the sentence structure, you just answer.
Exactly. And that's the goal. You don't want to become someone who's constantly translating. You want English to become a direct connection between your thoughts and your words. It doesn't happen overnight, but it absolutely can happen.
So here's a question. If translating is slowing people down, how do you actually stop doing it? Because it's not like you can just wake up one morning and decide, "Okay, from today, I'm thinking only in English."
I wish it were that easy. No, it's something you build little by little. One of the easiest exercises I ever came across was surprisingly simple. Instead of trying to think about complicated topics, you start with whatever's around you. Look at your desk. My laptop is open. Look outside. It's getting cloudy. Pick up your coffee. This coffee is still hot. They're tiny sentences, but they're powerful because you're creating thoughts directly in English instead of translating them.
I actually tried something similar a while ago. I remember walking through a grocery store and just naming things in English. Apples, milk, rice. Then I'd make slightly longer sentences like, "I need to buy some eggs," or "I forgot to bring a shopping bag." At first, it felt a little silly.
Did anyone catch you talking to yourself?
Thankfully, no. Although if they had, they probably would have thought I was planning the world's most detailed grocery list.
Honestly, talking to yourself is one of those things that sounds strange until you realize how many language teachers recommend it. People hear talk to yourself and immediately picture someone having a full conversation in the mirror. It doesn't have to be like that. You're simply giving your brain more opportunities to produce English.
And the best part is, there's zero pressure. Nobody's judging you, nobody's correcting your pronunciation. You can make as many mistakes as you want because you're the only person listening.
Exactly. And here's something people don't realize. Your brain doesn't really care whether you're speaking to another person or speaking to yourself. Either way, you're practicing the skill of turning thoughts into spoken English. That's the important part.
I love that because it removes one of the biggest excuses people have. A lot of learners say, I don't have anyone to practice with. And while having a conversation partner is definitely helpful, it's not the only way to improve.
Not even close. In fact, I'd argue that if you're not comfortable speaking to yourself yet, jumping into conversations with other people can feel overwhelming. Think of it like learning to ride a bike. You probably wouldn't start by riding through busy city traffic. You'd practice somewhere quiet first. Speaking to yourself is that quiet place. It's where you build confidence before bringing someone else into the conversation.
That's a great way to look at it. You're not avoiding real conversations, you're preparing for them. And I think that's an important distinction.
Definitely. Because the goal isn't to spend years talking only to yourself. The goal is to make speaking feel natural enough that when a real conversation happens, your brain doesn't panic. It already knows what it feels like to produce English, and that changes everything.
Now that we've talked about translating in your head, I think it's a good time to discuss something that almost every learner has done at least once. They think, maybe I just need to memorize more vocabulary. Have you ever gone through that phase?
Oh, absolutely. I think every English learner has. You download a vocabulary app, promise yourself you're going to learn 20 new words every day, and after a few months, you've memorized hundreds of words. It feels productive. The problem is, when someone starts talking to you, half of those words don't even come to mind.
Exactly. It's funny because if I asked someone, do you know the word opportunity? They'd probably say yes. But if I asked them, tell me about an opportunity you've had recently, they might suddenly forget the word they just told me they knew.
That's because recognizing a word and using it are two completely different things. Think about it this way. Imagine I show you a picture of a bicycle. You immediately know what it is. But if I ask you to build a bicycle from scratch, that's a completely different skill. Vocabulary works in a very similar way. Recognizing words is one skill, using them naturally is another.
And I think that's why people get frustrated. They'll say, I've learned 5,000 words. Why can't I speak fluently? Well, because learning words isn't the same as learning how to use them.
Exactly. I'd actually argue that learning words without using them is a little like buying books and never reading them. It feels like progress because your collection keeps growing, but nothing really changes until you start putting them into practice.
I love that analogy. And you know what else people collect? Grammar courses.
Oh, don't get me started. There was a time when I genuinely believed that one more grammar book would solve all my problems. I'd finish one course, then think, maybe I need a more advanced one. I'd finish that one, then I'd convince myself I still wasn't ready to speak.
It's almost like we keep moving the finish line. First it's, I'll start speaking after I learn the present perfect. Then it's, actually, I should probably master conditionals first. Then it's, maybe after phrasal verbs. And somehow there's always another chapter waiting.
Exactly. And don't get us wrong. Grammar matters. Vocabulary matters. Pronunciation matters. We're not saying those things aren't important. We're just saying they shouldn't stop you from speaking. Because here's the truth. You don't need perfect grammar to have a conversation.
That's such an important point. Think about children. When they're learning their first language, they make grammar mistakes all the time. Nobody expects them to be perfect. People simply respond to what they're trying to communicate.
And even native speakers make grammar mistakes. Sometimes they speak too quickly. Sometimes they use the wrong word. Sometimes they change direction halfway through a sentence. Real conversations are messy. They're not like textbook examples.
I think textbooks accidentally create unrealistic expectations. Every dialogue sounds perfect. Nobody interrupts, nobody forgets words, nobody says, wait, that's not what I meant. Real life isn't like that.
Exactly. If you listen carefully to podcasts, interviews, or even casual conversations, you'll notice something interesting. People pause. They restart sentences. They search for words. They say things like, let me think, or how do I explain this? That's completely normal. Fluent speakers don't speak perfectly. They speak comfortably.
I think that's one of the biggest mindset shifts someone can make. Instead of asking, how can I speak perfectly? Start asking, how can I keep the conversation going? Those are two very different goals.
And usually the person you're talking to doesn't care whether your sentence was grammatically perfect. They care whether they understood your message. Communication is the goal, not perfection.
You know what this reminds me of? People who spend 6 months reading books about swimming without ever getting into the water.
That's actually a great comparison. Eventually, you have to get wet. You can't become a swimmer by reading about swimming, and you can't become a confident speaker by only studying English. At some point, you have to actually use it.
And yes, it's going to feel uncomfortable at first. Nobody likes making mistakes. Nobody enjoys forgetting simple words in the middle of a sentence. But that awkward stage isn't a sign you're doing something wrong. It's a sign you're doing exactly what you need to do.
I couldn't agree more. Every confident English speaker you admire has gone through that stage. The difference is, they didn't stop when it felt uncomfortable. They kept going until speaking became natural. And honestly, that's encouraging, because it means fluency isn't something you're born with. It's something you build through practice.
All right, we've spent a lot of time talking about what doesn't work, or at least what isn't enough on its own. So let's switch gears a little. If someone listening right now is thinking, okay, I get it, I need to practice speaking, but what should I actually do tomorrow? Where would you tell them to start?
I'd probably tell them not to overcomplicate it. One thing I've noticed is that people love looking for the perfect study plan. They'll spend hours watching videos titled "The Fastest Way to Become Fluent" or "The Secret Method Nobody Talks About." Sometimes they spend more time searching for the perfect technique than actually practicing.
That's so true. It's almost like productivity becomes a hobby. You organize your notes, download 5 different apps, buy another course, and somehow the only thing you don't do is actually speak.
Exactly. So if I had to recommend one technique, the first one would probably be shadowing.
I've heard that term a lot, but I think some people still aren't sure what it actually means.
It's much simpler than it sounds. Let's say you're watching a YouTube video or listening to a podcast. Instead of just listening passively, you pause after a sentence. Or if you're comfortable, you repeat it almost immediately while the speaker is still talking. The goal isn't just to copy the words. You're copying the pronunciation, the rhythm, the speed, and even the emotion. You're training your mouth as much as your brain.
So you're almost acting like an actor rehearsing someone else's lines.
Exactly. That's actually a great comparison. Actors don't just memorize words. They pay attention to timing, pauses, emphasis, and tone of voice. Language learners can do the same thing. If someone says, "I can't believe that actually happened," don't just repeat the words like a robot. Copy the excitement, copy the surprise. The more closely you imitate natural speech, the more natural your own speech starts to sound.
And I think that's something a lot of people overlook. They focus so much on grammar that they forget speaking is also a physical skill. Your mouth has to get used to making certain sounds. Your tongue has to move differently. Your brain has to connect ideas quickly. The only way to improve those things is by actually speaking.
Exactly. Nobody expects to play the piano after reading a music book. You have to put your fingers on the keys. Speaking works the same way. You have to train the muscles involved, not just your memory.
All right, here's another technique I've heard people recommend: recording yourself. I'll be honest, I think a lot of people avoid it because they hate hearing their own voice.
Oh, absolutely. The first time I heard my own recorded voice, I thought, there's no way I actually sound like that. It's uncomfortable for almost everyone, but that's exactly why it's useful. When you're speaking, you're focused on getting your ideas out. When you're listening to a recording, you become the listener. Suddenly, you notice things you never noticed while speaking.
Maybe you're talking too fast. Maybe you're repeating the same word over and over. Maybe you're pausing every few seconds because you're searching for vocabulary. Those are things you can actually improve once you're aware of them.
I like that because it gives you immediate feedback. You don't have to wait for a teacher or a language partner to point something out. You can hear it yourself.
Exactly. And here's something I'd recommend. Don't record a 1-minute speech every single day about the same topic. Instead, change the topic. One day, describe your room. The next day, talk about your favorite movie. Another day, explain how to cook your favorite meal. After that, maybe tell a story about something funny that happened to you. You're not just practicing English, you're practicing different kinds of conversations.
That actually sounds much more interesting than repeating the same introduction every day. Because let's be honest, most people have introduced themselves 100 times.
Exactly. If your practice only consists of saying, "Hi, my name is," you're not preparing yourself for real conversations. Real conversations change topics all the time, so your practice should too.
There's another technique I don't think gets enough attention. Reading out loud. Not silently, actually speaking the words.
I'm so glad you brought that up. People often separate reading and speaking, but reading out loud combines both. You get exposed to natural sentence structures, and at the same time, you're practicing pronunciation and fluency. It's especially useful if you're reading something that's written in conversational English rather than formal textbook language.
And the nice thing is, you don't have to guess what to say. The words are already there. You're simply focusing on saying them smoothly and naturally.
Exactly. Think of it as a bridge between listening and free speaking. It's easier than creating your own sentences from scratch, but it still trains your speaking ability. And for a lot of learners, that's a really comfortable place to start before moving into spontaneous conversations.
So, if we were putting together a simple daily routine, it wouldn't need to be 3 hours long. Maybe 10 minutes of shadowing, 5 or 10 minutes talking to yourself, a few minutes reading something out loud, and maybe a short recording at the end.
Honestly, I'd take that routine every day over someone who studies grammar for 3 hours once a week, because language learning rewards consistency far more than intensity. 15 or 20 minutes focused every day can do much more than one long study session, followed by 6 days of doing nothing. And I think that's something people often underestimate.
You know, there's one piece of advice I wish someone had given me much earlier. Instead of learning individual words, learn complete phrases. When I first heard that, I didn't really understand why it mattered.
That's such a good one. Most of us learn English like this. Decision. Okay, that's a new word. Then, make. That's another new word. But native speakers don't usually think of those words separately. They think of the phrase, make a decision. They've heard it so many times that it comes out automatically.
Exactly. Or think about phrases like, by the way, at the end of the day, to be honest, or it depends. Nobody stops to build those word by word. They're stored as one unit.
And that's actually how children learn their first language too. They don't memorize grammar rules first. They hear patterns over and over again. Eventually, those patterns become automatic. That's why learning in phrases can make your speech sound much more natural.
It also makes speaking faster. Instead of creating every sentence from scratch, you're connecting little building blocks together. It's kind of like Lego. You already have pieces built, you just combine them differently depending on the situation.
Exactly. Another thing I'd recommend is something called sentence mining. Now, the name sounds a little technical, but the idea is incredibly simple. Whenever you hear a sentence that feels useful, save it. Not because it's difficult, because it's practical.
Can you give an example?
Sure. Let's say you're watching a YouTube video and someone says, "I wasn't expecting that at all." Don't just write down the word expecting. Write down the whole sentence. Then later, change it. I wasn't expecting the weather to be this hot. I wasn't expecting the movie to end like that. I wasn't expecting you to call today. You're learning a sentence pattern instead of a single vocabulary word.
That actually sounds much more useful. Because real conversations aren't made of isolated words. They're made of patterns that people use again and again.
Exactly. And once you've collected enough of those patterns, speaking starts feeling much easier. Not because you've become a genius overnight, but because your brain has more ready-made material to work with.
Here's another thing I think holds people back. They're afraid of sounding repetitive, so they avoid using words they already know because they think they need a more advanced vocabulary.
Oh, that's a really common mistake. People think using simple words makes them sound less fluent. In reality, using simple words confidently is much more impressive than trying to use complicated words incorrectly. If you listen to everyday conversations between native speakers, they're not trying to sound like a dictionary. Most of the time, they're using simple, familiar vocabulary.
That's true. You don't need a different synonym every time you say good. Sometimes good is exactly the right word.
Exactly. Fluency isn't about sounding complicated. It's about expressing your ideas clearly. That's a huge difference.
Now, before we wrap up, I want to talk about something that's become really popular over the last couple of years: using AI to practice English. What's your opinion on that?
Honestly, I think it's one of the best tools learners have today if they use it the right way. Years ago, one of the biggest problems was finding someone to practice with. Maybe your friends didn't speak English, maybe you couldn't afford a tutor, maybe your schedule didn't match anyone else's. Now you can open an AI chatbot, start a conversation, ask it to correct your mistakes, or even ask it to role-play different situations. That's an incredible opportunity.
I completely agree. The important thing, though, is remembering that AI is a tool. If you're only asking it grammar questions all day, you're missing the biggest advantage. Use it to actually have conversations. Ask it to pretend it's a waiter in a restaurant, or someone interviewing you for a job, or a tourist asking for directions. The more realistic the situation, the better the practice.
Exactly. And don't be afraid to make mistakes. That's literally what it's there for. It won't laugh, it won't judge you, it'll just keep helping you improve.
All right, Emma. If someone has listened to this entire episode and only remembers 3 things, what would you want those 3 things to be?
I'd say, first, stop waiting until you feel ready. Confidence comes from speaking, not before speaking. Second, don't learn English one word at a time. Learn useful phrases and sentence patterns that you could actually use in conversations. And finally, be consistent. You don't have to study for 3 hours every day. 20 focused minutes every single day will usually take you much further than one long study session once a week.
I think those are 3 fantastic takeaways. And if I could add one more, be patient with yourself. If you can already understand English but you're struggling to speak it, don't assume you're failing. It usually means you're much closer than you think. Now it's just about training a different skill. Speaking is a muscle, and like any other skill, the more you practice it, the more natural it becomes.
Exactly. So if you've been feeling stuck lately, hopefully today's conversation reminded you that you're definitely not alone. Every fluent speaker was once the person who paused in the middle of a sentence, forgot simple words, or felt nervous about making mistakes. The only difference is that they kept going.
And hopefully, after today's episode, you'll do the same. If you enjoyed this conversation, we'd love to hear from you. What's been the biggest challenge in your English learning journey? Leave us a comment. We read them all. And who knows, maybe your question or experience will inspire a future episode.
Thanks so much for spending your time with us. We really hope you found something useful today.
We'll be back next week with another conversation. Until then, take care,
Keep learning.
and we'll see you in the next episode of Talkie.